Chapter 11. Last Confession. Aunt Sarah had prepared a meatloaf for us before she left for the brunch at Grandma Olivia's. She moved about the kitchen like a robot, not really looking at things. Her eyes resembled two glass orbs, lifeless on the outside with no light of their own, merely reflecting what was in front of her. I imagine that inside her thoughts were lightning bugs zigzagging from one end of her head to the other, tracing her fears, anxieties, and sorrows across the black wall of despair. May set the table and I worked on the mashed potatoes while Aunt Sarah checked the meatloaf and prepared some steamed vegetables. We all kept busy, avoiding each other and taking solace in our labors. "We were just sitting around talking," she said suddenly, as if she heard me ask what happened. Everyone was having a good time. The food was delicious as ever, and Samuel was very jolly, I thought. Olivia had invited the Congressman Dunlop and his wife Joan. We were all having such a good time. She paused to look at me. "Olivia was very concerned about you. She asked me dozens of questions, wanting to know how you were and how well you were getting along at your job. She was disappointed about your not coming. I think Samuel was even more disappointed. The judge kept asking about you too. Finally, the Congressman Dunlop burst out with, 'Who is this young lady everyone's so interested in? I have to meet her.' Everyone laughed, even Jacob. 'What about Carrie?' I asked. Oh, he had taken May down to the beach. They weren't far off." She sighed deeply and continued to prepare the dinner, talking as she went to the stove. They got into a political discussion and the judge had an argument with the congressman about taxes. They were getting pretty riled up. No one noticed Jacob rubbing his chest and taking deep breaths until suddenly she paused and looked at the wall as if the scene were being projected onto it. Suddenly he struggled to his feet, made a strange sound and fell forward on the grass. The congressman was first at his side. He had been in the army, so he took training in CPR. Jacob complained about pressure on his chest and the pain up his arm and shoulder. The congressman said it looked like a heart attack and we should get an ambulance quickly. I was no good to anyone. I couldn't move. My legs turned right into butter. All I could do was hold on to the chair and cry. But Olivia, you should have seen her, Melanie. She said with a wide smile of appreciation and admiration on her lips. She stood up like a general, coolly dictating commands, Aunt Sarah said, and then demonstrated, pointing this way and that. "Samuel, go make the phone call. Nelson, go get a pillow and a few blankets from the maid." She even told the congressman's wife to pour some water for Jacob. In minutes, everyone was moving about doing something. Then she turned to me, Aunt Sarah said, imitating Grandma Olivia's expression. "Sarah, get a grip on yourself. Go get the children immediately," she ordered. And I tell you, when she turned her eyes on me, I felt my buttery legs harden into stone and my spinal cord turned to steel. I nodded and went out to the beach. Carrie was devastated. He couldn't believe his father had collapsed. Carrie had been a tower of strength. He's never been sick, never missed a day of work, and never complained about muscle aches and pains, no matter how hard he works and how miserable the weather. I've seen him come home with his face blue from the cold, but he never so much as moaned. When the ambulance arrived, Olivia hovered over the paramedics, making sure they did everything as quickly and effectively as possible. Then she organized us into 2 cars and we followed the ambulance to the hospital. Carrie drove our car. When we arrived, she went to the emergency room doctor immediately and got him to go see Jacob. He reported to her before he reported to anyone else. It seemed like only minutes before they had a heart specialist beside Jacob, and Jacob in the CCU. I never saw Olivia any stronger. She inspired me, and I kept myself together. After a few hours, she told us to go home and get some rest. There was nothing more to see about his condition. All the while I kept thinking, if Olivia, who's Jacob's mother, can be so strong, I have to be strong too. So I kept my tears back and did what she said. Carrie worries me now, she continued. He didn't say a word until he spoke to you. He'll be fine, Aunt Sarah, I promised, even though I didn't know if I had the right to make such assurances. I certainly had no track record of success when it came to predictions about people. She sighed again and returned to the meatloaf. Everything's ready, she declared. Can you get Carrie and Melanie? Of course, Aunt Sarah. I went to the stairway and called him, but he didn't respond. So I went upstairs to get him, and I called him from the bottom of the attic letter, and he still didn't answer me. When I looked in the attic room, I found him sitting, staring at the model of the lobster boat. Carrie, dinner's ready, I said. Your mother wants you to come down. She needs you, Carrie. I made this when I was only 7 years old, he said, staring down at the model. Dad was really surprised how well it came out. For a while, he kept it downstairs on the mantel so Dad could show it to his friends. He wasn't always this way, you know. When I first started to go out to the boat with him, we were more like brothers than father and son. He taught me everything about the boat business and said I was his good luck charm. We had much better catches in those days. After Laura's death, everything changed. Sometimes I think we all died with her, he said. In different ways, I guess. Dad kept too much inside, eating away. Then I became a disappointment to him. You're not a disappointment to anyone, Carrie. Anyone who says that just doesn't know. You've been a better son than any boy I've ever met. But you are your own person, and it's not a sin for you to want things different from your father's desires. Deep inside himself, your father knows that, and he has nothing to do with this, I'm sure, I said. He raised his shoulders slowly and turned. But after last night, he hasn't struck me for years, he said. And he shouldn't have last night. I'm sorry, Carrie. I don't mean to say things bad about him now, of all times, but he was wrong, and I think he realized that right away. And that's what bothered him the most. You have to be strong for your mother, Carrie, and for May. She's so dependent on us, especially you. She's like someone who's fallen overboard and barely floating on a tiny raft of hope. He nodded. Yeah, you're right. Of course. You gotta be as strong as your father was for this family, I said. Now come on down and eat something, I ordered. He smiled. Aye, aye, Captain, he said, saluting. He rose and followed me down the ladder into the dining room. When Aunt Sarah saw him, she brightened a bit. Serving the meal helped her keep herself together. We need a special reading tonight, she told him when we sat at the table. He nodded and opened the Bible. None of us had much of an appetite, but even May saw how important it was to eat as much as she could to please Aunt Sarah. After dinner, we all helped clean up, and then Carrie announced he would drive us all to the hospital. Oh dear, Aunt Sarah said, maybe I should change into something fresh, and maybe May should put on... None of that matters, Ma, Carrie said with authority. We're only there to be at Dad's bedside and give him comfort. She nodded. Carrie had already taken the reins. He was at the helm and in control of all of our actions and direction. We got in the car and drove to the hospital, no one saying much until we arrived. The cardiac care unit permitted only one immediate family visits for 5 minutes every half hour on the hour. Carrie decided May should wait in the lounge with me while he and Aunt Sarah went to see Uncle Jacob. Grandma Olivia and Grandpa Samuel had gone home for the night and left orders for the doctor to call them if there were any dramatic changes. I kept May amused and answered her questions about the hospital. One of Papa George's friends had died of a heart attack 2 years before, and I recalled some of the details about blocked arteries, destroyed muscle, and water in his lungs. I didn't tell May any gruesome details, but her eyes were dark with worry and fear when I explained how the heart worked. We feel like strangers to each other so often in our lives, I thought. It's hard enough for most people to explain, express, and communicate their feelings, fears, and dreams to each other. May was born with a disadvantage and given another obstacle to overcome. It was at times like these when that handicap would announce itself most loudly and make the rest of us feel even more frustrating trying to help her, therefore help ourselves. When Carrie and Aunt Sarah came out, they both looked glum, Aunt Sarah dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Carrie looked pale. Even his lips had lost most of their color. He guided his mother to the settee and he turned to me. It's hard seeing him hooked up to all that oxygen and the heart monitor clicking away. He looked small in that bed, like a corpse. His tears started to go down his cheeks. May started to cry and moved her hands more desperately for the news. Carrie signed to her that Uncle Jacob was still sick, but getting better, and he told her to sit with their mother. Carrie turned back to me. He can talk, he said, just barely a whisper. But he can talk. Just before he left, he asked me about you, and I told him you were out here. He asked about me? Yes. Then he said, Carrie paused and looked back at his mother, then back at me. Then he said he wanted you to go see him alone. What? That's what he said, Melanie. I told the head nurse, and she said to wait 15 minutes and then send you back to see him. She said it would be all right. I told her you were my sister, he said. Why does he want to see me? I felt like a hand of ice was stroking down my back and neck and then moving down my spine. He thinks he's gonna die tonight, he said, and he wants to tell you something before he does. Carrie replied, taking a deep breath before going to sit with his mother and sister. I felt as if I swallowed a dozen goldfish and they were all flopping in my stomach. Carrie checked his watch and looked at me across the small lobby. It seemed that he was looking at me across a chasm so wide and deep that it could never reach the end. I sat back. Of all people Uncle Jacob wanted to see, me. Maybe he wanted to lie some curse on me or blame me for his condition. Maybe he wanted me to promise to leave his house for good. Or maybe one of those deeply buried secrets was about to rear its ugly head. I took deep breaths. May gazed at me with her eyes big, and the expression on her face mixed with fear and hope. Aunt Sarah bit down on her lower lip and nodded to unheard voices. Carrie stared ahead. I vaguely heard the voices of other people around us and heard the footsteps of nurses and technicians. My heart pounded harder with every passing minute. And then Carrie gazed at his watch and looked at me. It's time, he said. Go in. They'll show you where he is, he added. I didn't think I could stand, but I did. I gazed at Aunt Sarah, who looked up at me with curiosity and confusion, yet with a prayer on her lips and in her eyes. I smiled at her and May and started toward the door of the cardiac care unit, my legs and feet floating over the hard-tiled floor. I opened the door and entered the room. I sucked in my breath and started across the room, passing elderly patients until I heard a nurse greet me. Melanie Logan, she said with a brief smile. Yes, ma'am. Right this way, she said, and nodded towards the last bed on the right where Uncle Jacob was hooked to his life-saving machinery and monitors waiting. inches from death's grasp. Carrie was right about him. He did resemble a corpse, pallid, small, and withered. I looked at the nurse. You can stay here for a few minutes and see if he wakes. Otherwise, come back later. On the hour, she suggested. She checked the drip of his IV bag and then walked out to the nurse's station. Timidly, I drew closer to Uncle Jacob's bed and gazed down at him. The beep on the monitor seemed to mirror my own drumming heart. Half of me wanted him to remain asleep, while the other half couldn't contain my curiosity. I was tempted to flee and also tempted to touch his hand to see if he would waken. His eyelids trembled and I saw his lips stiffen. Uncle Jacob, I said, or at least I thought I did. Maybe I just thought it. He didn't acknowledge me. Uncle Jacob, I said a little louder. His eyelids fluttered, then opened. He turned slowly and looked at me. As I did, he mouthed my name. I leaned in because he was barely whispering. Melanie, come closer, he said. I looked back at the nurse's station and brought my face as close to his as I could. What is it, Uncle Jacob? You should just rest and get better. He shook his head. Won't get better, he said. He swallowed, the effort causing him to close his eyes. His Adam apple strained against his skin. He opened his eyes again. My fault, he said. It was my fault. What was your fault, Uncle Jacob? Callie. My mother? I don't understand. Uncle Jacob, what are you saying? Hallie. When I was a young boy, she was barely 13, but I did a terrible thing. Made her do it. She never told, but it was my fault. My fault she became what she was. And we had all the family trouble. I stared at him. His eyes were watery, dark, and pupils smaller. Suddenly he found my hand and squeezed my fingers as hard as he could, which wasn't very hard. I didn't mean to be so hard on you, but I feel more responsible, he said after a big breath. He closed his eyes and opened them quickly. A sin can last forever, be passed from mother to daughter, from father to son, forever. Be a good woman and end the devil's hold on us all. He swallowed hard and closed his eyes, and he whispered, my poor Laura. Poor, poor Laura. His head fell to the right and the monitor began a long, shrilling, humming sound. I released his hand and stepped back. Stat, I heard someone behind me. Turned nurses rushed past me across the CCU. I backed away slowly. Someone shouted, clear. I saw Uncle Jacob's body jump and heard again, clear. I fled the CCU. Carrie was waiting in the hallway and I ran into his arms. What, he cried. Something's happening to him. Dad, he groaned and charged through the door into the ICU. I waited a moment and then turned to see Aunt Sarah and May standing in the lounge. Aunt Sarah's hand was on May's shoulder and both of them gazing at me with some horrified look in their eyes. I started to cry. My stomach felt hollow, just the way it had felt when I learned Daddy had been killed in the mining accident. Aunt Sarah started to shudder with her own sobs. I went to both of them, and the three of us embraced and held each other and waited. All one heart, small and trembling, alone and helpless against the dark cloud, moving along with the wind raging around us. He's back, Carrie cried from the doorway. He was laughing through his tears. It's a resurrection. We turned and gazed at him. He wiped his cheeks with the back of his hand and took a deep breath. Back, Aunt Sarah said. What does that mean, Carrie? I asked. His heart stopped, but they got it started again, he said. He's doing okay for now. Oh, praise God, Aunt Sarah cried. Praise God. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes and said my own prayer of thanks. When I fled the CCU, I believed I had caused that heart failure. Carrie regained his calm demeanor and strength. How about a cup of hot tea, Ma? I can get it from the machine downstairs. Yes, thank you. I'll get May a soda. Melanie, do you want something? I'll come with you, I said, and got up. We walked to the elevator. When the door opened, he took my hand, and we stepped in. I really thought he was a goner, Carrie muttered. I watched them struggling, but the doctor hung in there, and suddenly the monitor began clicking again. Everyone cheered, and then we waited for the pulse to build up. It's a miracle, he added, don't you think? Yes, Carrie. He nodded, so filled with joy he was beside himself. Then he remembered I had been in there. As the door of the elevator opened, he turned to me. What did he want? I think it was something he wanted only me to know, Carrie. I don't feel right talking about it. I hope you understand. Oh, sure, he said, although his eyes betrayed his hurt. It wasn't a time for a father to keep secrets from his son. I understand. It must have been pretty important to him, though. He was willing to chance dying to do it, huh? I nodded, and we went to the vending machine. Carrie went to check on Uncle Jacob one final time, and he returned to Aunt Sarah to go with him. And Aunt Sarah decided they should take May so she could see if Uncle Jacob was still alive. I waited for them in the lounge, thinking about the things Uncle Jacob had said. He sensed death at his door and felt he had to confess to me. I realized how much blame he had carried in his heart all these years, but I doubted if that was the main cause of any sins Mommy had committed afterwards. He's stabilized, Carrie told me after they emerged from the CCU. Let's go home and get some sleep. We're all exhausted. I couldn't argue with that. May actually fell asleep in my arms, and Aunt Sarah looked as if she would topple over herself any moment. Carrie helped her out of the car and into the house. We wanted to go to the kitchen to get some final cleanup, but he insisted that she go right upstairs and go to bed. Dad's going to need you to be stronger than ever, Ma. You can't run yourself down now, he said with authority. She nodded. Yes, you're right, Carrie. Thank God we have you. You're the strength now, she said, and she took his arm. What a day, huh? I smiled. I can't think of a better way to spend our time. I can think of better ways to spend our time, if that's what you mean, I said. He laughed. It was good to see his face brighten, but I confess I'm tired too. I'll make sure everything's off and put away, he said. Then I'll stop by to say goodnight. He leaned over to kiss me on the cheek and walked off. I hurried upstairs and got dressed for bed, putting on the light blue cotton nightgown. If there was ever a time to practice Holly's meditation, it was now, I thought, and I sat in the lotus position on the bed and concentrated. I was so deeply involved I didn't even hear Carrie come through my door. I felt his hand on my shoulder and opened my eyes. Did it work, he asked. You're meditating? Yes. I felt the tension drain from my body, just as Holly said. I guess I'll have to learn it now too, he said. I unfolded my legs and sat back against the pillows. Mind if I stay here with you for a while, he asked. Of course not. He took off his shoes and laid next to me on the bed, putting his head on my lap. I stroked his hair and he closed his eyes. When Laura and I were really little, one of us got scared, we would sit together like this for a while. I think we did it till we were like 14 or 15, he admitted. It was a nice safe haven in the storm, whether the storm is in your heart or out there. You were lucky to have each other, I said. He opened his eyes and looked up at me, thinking, it must have been difficult for you growing up alone, away from family. I smiled. I had Papa George and Grandma Arlene, as well as Daddy. Sometimes Mommy was there for me too. He nodded, still thoughtful, then he smiled. "Sing to me one of those fiddle songs, a soft one," he asked. I laughed and I began singing one of Papa George had taught me. It was really like a prayer of a miner's wife, praying that her husband would always be safe in the bowels of the earth. And it ended up on a happy note because he always came up smiling through the coal dust. Singing it reminded me of Daddy, and I couldn't help the tears rolling over my eyelids. But Carrie didn't notice the crack in my voice. When I looked down at him, I saw he was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling gently. I didn't have the heart to wake him, so I crawled under the blanket, fixed the pillow under his head too, then I reached over and turned off the light. Darkness fell like a heavy blanket. The moon peeked out from between the two passing clouds and sent a ray of white light through the window, washing us both. I closed my eyes, and in minutes I was deeply asleep as Carrie. Hours later I awoke with a start. For a moment I forgot what happened, and it all came rushing back as I sat up, realizing Carrie was no longer beside me. He was at the window gazing out. "Carrie? Oh," he said, turning. "I should have gone to my room. I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't. Are you all right?" "Yeah, I just woke up and felt a little nervous." I like looking out at the ocean whenever I get nervous. I guess that's where I find my meditation. Laura's room always had a better view of the coast than mine. I would either come up here or go to the attic. "I'll leave you to let you sleep," he said, turning from the window and starting toward the door. "No, don't leave," I said. He paused. "I can't stay here all night. Ma wouldn't understand," he said. "Just stay a little while longer." "I'll fall asleep again," he threatened. "I won't let you," I said. Something in my voice brought a smile to his face that was so bright I couldn't even see it in the darkness. He returned to my bed and sprawled out beside me. Then he leaned forward and kissed me gently on the cheek. We embraced and then kissed again. His hands moved over my shoulders and down my arms. "Oh, Melanie," he said, "I do care for you and love you and need you more than I'll ever need anyone." I closed my eyes and didn't open them again until the first light in the morning. I was almost afraid to rise. Yet I couldn't escape the vivid memory of Uncle Jacob's heart stopping right before my eyes. As I showered and dressed, I tried to think of something else, anything else, but still the memory returned. With trembling legs, I started down the stairs. Aunt Sarah was already in the kitchen making pancakes, and Carrie and May were at the table. "Why didn't anyone wake me?" I asked. "Oh, you wouldn't be sleeping if you didn't need it," Aunt Sarah said. I looked at Carrie. His face had the shine of a polished stone. I called the hospital. Dad spent a good night and the doctor was already there. "That's wonderful, Carrie." He told the nurse to tell me not to bother coming to the hospital and waste my time standing around. He'd rather I take the boat to check our traps, he said, laughing. "I'll do both. Grandma Olivia and Grandpa Samuel are coming by to take Mother over to the hospital. May's going to go to school." I nodded. Carrie apparently had things organized. "You can go to work too," he said. "Oh, I should stay and help Aunt Sarah." "Nonsense, dear. I'm fine," she said. "Carrie's right." "Carrie's becoming a bit bossy, isn't he?" I asked, fixing my eyes on him. "He's the man of the house until Jacob gets back," Aunt Sarah said. "As long as he doesn't get too big for his britches," I remarked, and then signed the idea to May, who thought it was funny. "Now just a minute," Carrie protested. "Let's have a little more respect for the captain of this ship." "Well, we'll give the captain respect when he deserves it, but if he's an ogre, then there's always a chance of mutiny," I countered, and Carrie laughed. It was good to wake up to sunshine and hope for kindness again. I prayed it wouldn't be short-lived. Kenneth had already heard about Uncle Jacob and so had most of the local residents of Providencetown. Like any small town, news traveled fast, but bad news traveled even faster. When Kenneth came to pick me up, I brought him up to date. It doesn't surprise me, this heart attack, Kenneth said. The man was always brooding and grinding away his insides, even as a teenager. You all right? He inquired. Yes. Sarah must be a mess. She's doing okay, I said. Carrie's been a source of strength. Really? Good for him. Are you going to be able to work? He asked cautiously. Yes, it's the best thing and the best way to deal with worry. Work it under the sand, Kenneth laughed. That sounds like something of a beachcomber's wisdom, he remarked and drove on. We did work hard that week, and Kenneth made a great deal of progress, deciding by the week's end that he was ready to begin the actual sculpture. Holly did some painting of her own while we worked. By her description, her work was ethereal, spiritual, abstract, full of bright colors and ghostly shapes. In one painting, the woman she painted had stars looking down instead of eyes. Kenneth said she usually sold all her works in New York at her shop. Holly was always upbeat and pleasant and fun to be with, which proved refreshing during those troubled times. During my breaks, or when Kenneth finished with me early, Holly and I would walk along the beach or sunbathe, dressed in our headbands and saris. One day she decided to repaint her car, and I helped her create new images of pea greenish yellow exterior. Kenneth thought our work was so far out. Holly might be pulled over on the highway for violating sanity. Everyone laughed. I felt very comfortable being with the two, especially Holly. During this week, Carrie had taken over his father's role and actually had some very good days at sea, which he said buoyed Uncle Jacob and helped his recovery. I didn't go back to the CCU with them, but 2 days after they moved Uncle Jacob to what they call the step-down care, I accompanied the family on a visit. I noticed that Uncle Jacob avoided looking at me the whole time. Then just before we were about to go home, he whispered something to Carrie. Carrie asked me to remain. My father wants to talk to you privately again, he said. We'll wait for you in the lobby. I looked at Uncle Jacob, but he kept his eyes closed and lay back on his pillow. It wasn't until the others left that he opened his eyes. Actually, they snapped open, and he gazed at me with that all too familiar look of accusation. Carrie said you wanted me to stay for a few minutes, I said, approaching his bed. Yes. He looked away, sipped some water, then turned back to me. He tells me I asked to see you while I was in the ICU. Yes, I said, surprised that he had to be told. It was only for a few minutes, but I have no memory of this, but my doctors tell me that I could have easily hallucinated and said ridiculous things. You are to disregard anything I might have said under the condition I was in, he ordered. I hope you haven't gone blabbering it to anybody. No, I wouldn't do that, I said. Not even Kenneth Childs, he asked, his eyes shifting to me. No. Good. Then forget it all. It was gibberish. The babbling of a confused sick man. Do you understand, he asked. Do you, he insisted. Yes, Uncle Jacob. Good, he said. I hope you're helping Sarah during this hardship. Of course I am. And you're not taking advantage of my incapacity, he added. I would never take advantage, even if you were well, Uncle Jacob. He widened his eyes, and I looked away. I didn't want to get in any arguments with him now. If something should happen, I would surely be to blame. Maybe that's what he hoped. Just remember this discussion. Okay, I said. I hope you feel better, I added and turned to leave. Oh, I will, he said, and it sounded like a threat. I didn't look back, and I couldn't wait to get away from him, and I marched out quickly. Carrie looked up expectantly when I stepped out of the elevator. "Everything all right?" he asked quickly. "All right." I thought a moment. "Everything's back to normal," I said. Carrie raised his eyebrows. Aunt Sarah heard my words and misunderstood. "Yes," she said, "isn't it wonderful? The doctors think Jacob will be home sooner than we thought. Of course it'll be hard for us to make sure he doesn't do anything he shouldn't. He'll have to rest and avoid stress of any kind." "Sounds as if I should move out then," I muttered under my breath. I thought Carrie might have heard anyway because he looked very troubled. I took May's hand and we left the hospital. My mind went on how important family could be at times like this. I thought about Grandma Belinda and how it had been since I had visited. I decided I would return this weekend, even though she wandered about in a state of semi-confusion. I felt there was a possibility of love between us, or at least I hoped there was. I knew I would need it. The days that lie ahead were full of bleak promises, and even more obstacles to my happiness. But I had no idea just how much more. No idea at all. Not even Holly's horoscopes could reveal that.